Welcome to the Fantasy Football Endgame. Week 6, we're here to help you with tight end decisions. It's a tough world out there for tight ends, but we can help you hopefully make the right decision.
Make sure you stick around to the end when we tell you which tight ends are going to boom and win your week, and which ones are going to bust and leave you crying.
Tight ends often leave us crying because, well, there's just not a lot of depth out there once you get beyond those top few options. This week, you're going to be without Darren Waller, possibly Noah Fant. I know that game didn't even happen last week. He's questionable. But let's first talk about some good news, and that's a guy that came out of nowhere, literally out of nowhere, was 0% rostered, I think, before the season. Robert Tonyan of Green Bay. Everyone scrambled to pick him up, and then they had a bye week. So what are we feeling about him this week? Because that's the thing. Devontae Adams is going to be back, all right? So do you feel like he was fed just because they didn't have Adams? Of course, Lazard's on IR. Or do you think there's something there? And this is a matchup with Tampa Bay.
I mean, certainly no Adams, no Lazard helped them, right? Because Aaron Rodgers didn't really have a lot to throw to outside of MVS. So that definitely helps. Adams back will hurt. Lazard's not coming back anytime soon. We know that. I think you have to play him if you picked him up off of waivers, just because what other options do you really have out there that you feel better about at this point at tight end, right? Anybody worth playing is probably on somebody's roster already. There's no, waiver wire tight end just sitting out there waiting to be scooped up. I mean, maybe there will be after week 6, but there's nobody out there that you can look at right now and say, oh, that guy, yeah, play him. You'll feel good about playing him. So I think if you grab Tonyan, especially if you grabbed him and then sat him on your bench during the bye, you didn't sit him on your bench during the bye so you could sit him on your bench again after the bye. At least I hope not. I think if you got him, you got to play. Don't expect another monster game because, we know Adams is probably going to get, 10-plus targets this week. MVS will get his share of targets, so there's not going to be as much to go around for Tonyan. But Aaron Rodgers obviously trusts him, and that's good enough to make him a startable tight end.
Yeah, and that's a good point. If you went out, to grab him when he was a hot commodity, it's probably because you needed a tight end. So, yeah, you're probably going to start him. I'd say give it a go. With Lazard being out, that definitely helps. Obviously, he's not going to necessarily score 3 touchdowns, get as many targets. But given the tight end landscape, yeah, he could creep into the top 10. So I think a pretty solid streamer. Now, you mentioned there's not a lot out there. There's one guy who may be out there still, and of course you might be watching this after waivers, but maybe still forgotten. Maybe people don't believe because Irv Smith Jr. had done nothing up until now. Kind of the opposite of Tonyan. He was on the radar. He was probably owned in half of all leagues. People thought it could be a breakout second year for him, and he got dropped everywhere because he's done nothing. When I say nothing, I literally mean nothing, because in week 3, he wasn't even targeted. And in week 4, he had 0 catches for 0 yards on 1 target. So he's, I think, 5% rostered last week. And so, of course, then he breaks out, sort of. 4 catches, 64 yards, and did something. And that's kind of what we were expecting, right? There's not a lot out there in Minnesota after Thielen and Jefferson. They're not targeting the receivers, so why isn't the tight end getting more love? Do you think that Smith is streamable in a really good matchup against Atlanta?
Yes. It is a really good matchup against Atlanta. And he did come out of nowhere last week in a week when we were all really going oh, man, Justin Jefferson is going to have a monster game, and then he didn't, right? And we saw against Seattle, which Seattle the worst against wide receivers, and somehow Irv Smith is catching all these passes and Justin Jefferson's, sitting there on the, basically just running routes all day without getting the ball thrown to him, which is very frustrating. But there's a lot of risk here because, like you said, two games ago, no targets. A game before that, 1 target, no catch. Was that just a random thing? Did Seattle just say, okay, we're going to try to shut down Justin Jefferson? Which I doubt because they don't really have the personnel to do that. Obviously, Thielen had a nice game. Is he going to get targeted like that again? This is a low-volume passing attack anyways. Are they going to need to throw like that against Atlanta? They're not – they can probably just keep the game low-scoring and slow and be okay against Atlanta because it's not like – Atlanta has really shown much on offense this year either. So streamable, yes, but definitely there's a lot of risk there that he goes out there and gets you at 0.
Yeah, and that's the problem. I mean, he could definitely disappear, which is, we did the whole first part of this season, but I'm a little optimistic for two reasons. First of all, when I say Atlanta bad against that tight end, obviously it's, they're bad against everything right now, but they are the worst against tight ends for fantasy purposes, right? So that's something you can't just ignore, but also no Dalvin Cook. I think that obviously leads to opportunities because before, Madison, he just takes his place. Well, they would have Cook and then Madison would fill in. Now that Madison's the guy, I mean, they're going to give as many touches to Mike Boone or CJ Ham? No, I think they're going to try to spread the ball out a little bit more. And I do think now they've found something with Smith showing up, at least. I think he's going to get the ball a fair amount. So I think there's an opportunity. No, the floor is, is pretty non-existent. But if you're streaming tight end anyways, I like the odds. I'd rather take a roll of dice here than some other places. Now, let's talk about Zach Ertz because he's a guy that we shouldn't have to talk about, right? He should be a top 5 tight end, set it and forget it. And now we got to wonder if he's even startable because he's just gone missing, right? When Travis Fulgham is having a monster game, Zach Ertz is having 1 catch. He's combined for 15 yards the last 2 games combined. All right, so what's going on here? And do you just have to bench Ertz at this point?
I don't know what's going on here because, again, it seems like Zach Ertz should be having a great season, right? They have no pass catchers. Dallas Goedert is hurt. You would think Carson Wentz would just be throwing the ball to Zach Ertz like 15 times a game. It's just not happening. I don't know if Zach Ertz isn't getting a separation. I don't know if they got into some fight and they hate each other now. Who knows? But for whatever reason, he's not getting the targets. He's not getting what he should be getting. I think it's hard to say you have to bench him because it really comes down to what are your other options. But I think if you have any other tight end that you feel relatively good about, then yes, I would play that tight end over Zach Ertz. So is he benchable? Yes, in the right situation. And certainly I think there are plenty of tight ends I would play over him. So you might have one of those guys, but if you have one of those, if your choice is between like Zach Ertz and Irv Smith, I don't think I'm playing Irv Smith over Zach Ertz. I know the matchup is better for Irv Smith, but I still got to go with Zach Ertz. But like Robert Tonyan, yeah, I'll play him over Zach Ertz for sure. No doubt about it.
Yeah, and that's the tough call is do you go with a guy who, had a good week and then maybe has some upside over the guy that's had a good last couple of years and been a top tight end? The good news, I guess, for Ertz is you realize it's not that he is just getting ignored in the offense. He's actually still getting targeted. He's just not coming up with anything when he gets targeted. He did have 6 targets last week. Somehow only caught 1 of them for 6 yards. He had 5 targets the week before. He got 4 catches. I don't know how 4 catches turned into 9 yards. And then week before that, 10 targets, 7 targets, 7 targets. So he's actually still getting targeted. The big difference this year, his yards per target went from 6.8 last year to 4.1 this year. All right. So he's a drop of 3 from his career average. So they're just throwing it to him in shorter routes, not stretching the field. I don't know if it's just offensive philosophy or what, but maybe having Deshaun Jackson there helps to stretch the field. Maybe something changes, but I kind of feel like you could still start him with some kind of confidence because you probably don't have a much better option. What about the same division here? Evan Engram going against Washington. Kind of got involved last week. Still not as much as we like. He only had 1 catch. He had 2 carries. Somehow he out-carried his reception total, and he scored a touchdown. Engram should be going off, right, with all those injuries there, but he's not. So is Engram a guy that's on the radar?
This is another one. This is another guy where, like, we talked about with Juju and the wide receiver one. If I had told you before the season Saquon Barkley would be out for the year, Sterling Shepard would be playing, you would say Evan Ingram's a top 5 tight end, no doubt about it. Lock him in every single week and don't even worry about it. Yet here we are talking about Evan Engram. Like, can you start Evan Engram? Here's the thing. This Giants offense is horrendous right now. I know you look like people are like, well, they scored 34 points last week. They had 2 defensive touchdowns and they made 2 field goals of over 50 yards. That's 20 of their 34 points right there, right? So no, Yeah, they put 34 points on the scoreboard, but this offense only contributed 2 touchdowns against a terrible, terrible Cowboys defense, right? Um, Now this Washington matchup is nothing to fear for a tight end. Although and that's not really anything to fear for a tight end. The problem is, like you said, last week I think I had him as my boom in a great spot, and he only got 2 targets. Luckily, he got that touchdown to kind of give you something where you feel okay about it. Right? And it was a rushing touchdown. It wasn't even a receiving touchdown. You can't bank on that every week, like you said. So I guess you got to play Evan Engram, but maybe you don't. He's kind of like Zach Ertz to me. If you have another option that you feel okay about or you feel fairly confident in, because there's not a lot of tight ends that you feel great about outside of like the top 4 or 5, then yeah, start that guy over Evan Engram. But if it's between him and another super risky guy, I'd rather take the chance with Evan Engram, in another pretty good matchup and hope Daniel Jones looks his way a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely a risky play each week. The reason to consider Ingram is because going against Washington, they're in the bottom 5 in terms of the most points allowed to tight ends. So that's something, but yeah, it's a big risk. So, but then again, all these guys that we're talking about, that's why they're, tough decisions. They're all kind of fringy. So it depends what you're looking for. In a standard league, you got to go with the guy who might get you the touchdowns. Right now, I feel like it's Tonyan. In full PPR, I kind of like Smith, to be honest. I guess a little more risky there. But Engram, he's just very boom bust. And then you talk about the Cowboys. Dalton Schultz was a hot pickup. Had some nice games. Not so much last week. We can kind of maybe throw that out the window because of the whole quarterback change. But do you think this quarterback change to Dalton, is that going to be good or bad for Schultz?
I think it's going to be bad. And I talked about this in my video. And again, it's a very small sample size, but Dalton attempted 11 passes. None of them went Schultz's way. He threw 9 to the wide receivers, 3 each, and then 2 to Tony Pollard out of the backfield. Now, that doesn't mean he's not going to target Schultz. And we know when he had Tyler Eifert was a high-end fantasy asset for the Bengals, so it's not like he hasn't thrown to tight ends in the past. The problem is I don't think Dalton Schultz is going to get fed as much as he did with Dak Prescott. Now, I had Schultz as my bust last week because he was in a really tough matchup. So maybe it was just a matchup. Maybe he just couldn't get open. Maybe, he just wasn't the guy that they were looking for because he couldn't get separation in a tough matchup. This matchup it's not one of the best matchups, but it's like a middle-of-the-road matchup, so nothing to really fear about here. But I'm a little concerned for Dalton Schultz. I think if you have him, you got to roll him out just because we've seen it over, a few games now where he was involved enough. But I'm a little concerned going forward that he may not get the looks he was getting with Prescott. I think Dalton will target Gallup. Dalton's not afraid to throw it down the field, even if Gallup's not open. He'll gun it. He'll do it. He'll take his chances. So I'm a little nervous about Schultz, but I think you got to roll him out one more week and see what happens, just because he's been such a great pickup off the waivers for you. And when you're looking at these tight ends, you're looking at guys like Evan Engram, who's getting 2 targets, Irv Smith, who had 1 game the whole season, and now you're going to bank on that. Zach Ertz, again, who we're talking about. I think you got to roll with Dalton Schultz just because we've seen it over a 3-game stretch. We saw it where he was a productive fantasy tight end, and hope that Dalton looks his way.
Yeah, so you're feeling the Dalton connection here, right? Andy Dalton to Dalton Schultz. It's got to be a thing.
Didn't even think about that. Maybe that elevates him even a little higher.
I got to feel it's got to mean something. Maybe it doesn't. All right, so we talk about our booms and busts. Last week, recommended Darren Fells as a boom play. Came through with 57 yards and a touchdown. This week, going a little higher up in the rankings here. Guy, though, you didn't start last week because he was on bye. You might not have him you line up every week, but I do actually like TJ Hawkinson this week because going against the Jaguars, well, that's the same defense that Darren Fells faced last week. You do want to play tight ends against the Jaguars. Trust me on this. And Hawkinson, he's been really good when targeted, 9 yards per target, and he's just not getting targeted enough. This might be the time that they take advantage of him. So I like Hawkinson as a starting play over basically all those guys we've already mentioned. Yeah, actually, probably over Zach Ertz too. Who are you going with?
I like Eric Ebron against the Browns. Browns not very good against tight ends. Ebron's been coming on. He had 7 targets before their bye week, their COVID bye week, and then 6 targets last week. Had that fumble, which kind of hurt his fantasy points, but if he gets you 6 to 7 targets again this week against the Browns, he's going to pay off for you. I like Eric Ebron. I like Eric Ebron over all the guys we talked about, except T.J. Hawkinson. I agree with you. Big week incoming for T.J. Hawkinson.
All right, yeah, I think Hawkinson definitely for that matchup. You have Ebron as your boom. Guess what? I have Ebron as my bust, and I'll tell you why. Because not just the whole Chase Claypool thing, because Claypool went off, and that was when Ebron had his best game as a Steeler last week. If Deontay Johnson plays, that is kind of it seems to be the correlation there with Ebron. He gets involved when Johnson is out. I don't know if Johnson's going to play, right? We never know that, but it seems like he might. But here's the thing. I feel like it's a trap. I know that there's a good chance for a touchdown because Cleveland's been giving touchdowns to tight ends. I just don't trust Ebron enough. I feel like there's too many mouths to feed. They're not going to feed him on a consistent basis. So I actually would have said Tyler Higbee here, but I don't trust Sean McVay in any way. So because he's had 2 bad games in a row and this is a terrible matchup for tight ends, that's exactly why they're going to force feed Higbee because that's what Sean McVay does. All right. So who's your bust?
I got to go with Hayden Hurst. Tough matchup against the Vikings, and if that's not enough, I mean, he got some targets last week, but he's not getting the catches. Matt Ryan does not look very good, and he hasn't really been doing anything with Julio out. I mean, he catches a touchdown, which saves your week. You're like, oh, thank you, he caught the touchdown and got me some points. That's all he really does, and that's with Julio out. So whether Julio plays or not, I don't like Hayden Hurst at all this week. I think you got to bench him. You got to look somewhere else. And if Julio plays, he's not even startable to me at all because that will just completely crush his value. So I'm out completely on Hayden Hurst this week.
Yeah, there's certain situations, as much talent as you think the team has, when it gets to like dumpster fire status, you just avoid, right? And like the Jets are an obvious one. Okay, the Falcons are winless. They just fired their coach. It's a dumpster fire because now even that offense, that pass offense is not looking good. With or without Ridley, Julio, it doesn't matter. So I would avoid, except for those very top guys like Ridley and Julio if he's even healthy. But yeah, you can safely avoid Hurst, I would say. All right, don't avoid us. Hit that subscribe button. Give us a thumbs up. Hit that little notification bell if you liked what you saw. Guys, we do this every week for every position: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end to help you win. That's our end game. Thanks for watching.